Good afternoon, I'm Shannon Derehove. Welcome to today's webinar hosted on behalf of Sustainability and ESG Africa Conference and Expo. Today's webinar focuses on the Taskforce on Nature-Based Financial Disclosure, or TNFD, and aims to give participants an overview of what TNFD covers, as well as some real-life experiences of implementing this new guideline. Before we start, please note that the chat and the Q&A are available to you. Please post your questions in the Q&A and your comments in the chat. Both the Q&A and the chat are at the bottom of your screen. Please be aware we're recording this webinar and we'll send the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live on YouTube and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. So let's get started. Today's moderator is Wendy Poulton. She's the co-founder of the Sustainability and ESG Africa Conference. She's also the director of Strategic Mindsets, a company specializing in strategy and risk consulting and coaching. Wendy will facilitate the discussion with today's panel, which consists of Candice Dott, Director of Market Engagement at the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure; Candice Stevens, the founder and CEO of Sustainable Finance Coalition; Dr. Warrick Fuchsloch, Senior Client Engagement Specialist at S&P Global Sustainable1; and Dr. Kieran Dobson, Head of ESG Client Engagement for EMEA at S&P Global Sustainable1. I'll hand over now to moderator Wendy Poulton to start the discussion. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Shannon, and welcome everybody to this, what I hope is going to be a really interesting discussion this afternoon. It's a topic that is gaining momentum all over the world as the TNFD guidelines come into bigger use. And we really want to use this session to help you understand what it is, what it covers, how you can go about using it, and also what are some of the new things that are going to happen in this space going forward. So we're very lucky to have our very experienced panel with us this afternoon. And in particular, we are very grateful to have Candice from the TNFD office in South Africa, who is going to be starting us off with a very brief overview of TNFD and the current status and some of the work that she's doing. So Candice, over to you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. I'm just going to quickly share my screen because I do have a few slides, and as requested, I will share a brief overview and just sort of set the scene, I think, which hopefully helps us with our panel discussion. I'm actually the leader of our market engagement activity in a global sense. I'm based in South Africa, but I also do quite a lot of our capacity building work across the region too. So I thought it was helpful to just set the scene quickly with something that I recently picked up in the last week. I know Ned Group Investments recently launched their responsible investment report, their annual report, so kudos to their team. But I kind of wanted to highlight on page 4 just the fact that the World Economic Forum risk report, which they highlight, gives an idea of the sentiments across policymakers, business leaders, academics, civil society representatives, highlighting the context of medium and long-term risks. So the infographics I've zoomed into on the left-hand side, but the 2-year and the 10-year outlooks from the WEF's latest survey, highlighting in the 2-year framing just something that Nedbank called out, or Ned Group called out, was citing short-term risks around disinformation and misinformation. Second year in the row that's happened. And then on a more long-term basis, which is where I want to zone you into it for the rest of today, we're starting to look at highlighting the effects of climate change and environmental degradation, which is featuring prominently. I think timeframes are really important when we have this discussion, also being able to see what some of the things are that might be coming. So I think 4 years ago, when the TNFD commenced its work in 2021, the majority of companies, financial institutions, thought of nature largely as a sort of corporate social responsibility issue. I think really around the marginal areas of expenditure related to conservation, recycling, various initiatives that organizations were doing and reporting on that connected their social license to operate. It also helped minimize reputational risk. I think the mindset's clearly shifting, and I think it's quite helpful to understand that the growing awareness among corporate executives, investors, insurers, capital providers are that nature is now a strategic risk management issue, not just a corporate social responsibility one. While the markets may see this through, some people in the market may see this through a narrow lens of corporate reporting or a compliance burden alone, I think the inescapable reality is that the resilience of business and capital portfolios depends on the resilience of nature, not just in a few sectors, but across all sectors of every economy. So what I'm really saying is this is not just about compliance. This is about better strategy, risk management, capital allocation, and being well prepared to respond to a growing interest and concern from investors and funders. You joined today's webinar to learn more about the TNFD and what it covers, and hopefully some practical experience of what it means to implement the TNFD framework. So I'm going to start with what is the TNFD. The Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure is a market-led, science-based task force of business and finance leaders, providing companies and financial institutions with the recommendations and guidance about how to incorporate nature beyond climate into their decision-making. Through better informed decision-making around governance, strategy, risk management, and capital allocation, the TNFD helps contribute to the global goal of shifting the flow of capital away from nature negative outcomes and towards nature positive outcomes for both planet and society. The TNFD has provided the market with a set of guidance and tools to enable the identification, assessment, and reporting of material nature-related issues, helping shift the flow of capital to conserve and also build back the resilience of nature is not only an investment, but it's also seen often as just a cost. It's really important to see it as an investment in relation to business resilience. I think we're going to talk quite a bit about the different tools and various aspects to help support organizations, but we firmly encourage all organizations, irrespective of size, reporting requirements, to start with identifying and assessing their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, what we call the DIROs. The LEAP guidance, one of the tools used, and we have a lot of guidance around how to use the LEAP approach, helps organizations with scoping and assessment work and provides an integrated assessment approach, which we call the LEAP approach, and that stands for locating the interface with nature, evaluating dependencies and impacts, assessing risks and opportunities, as well as preparing to respond and report. The TNFD LEAP approach can be used by organizations to understand their interface with nature, where nature risks might be present in their business models and their supply chains, perhaps in their balance sheets and across portfolios. And whilst using that understanding, helping organizations to take the steps to mitigate those risks and also help them support finding nature-related opportunities while they move forward with nature-positive outcomes. I think it goes without saying that the TNFD considers atmosphere and climate as one of the 4 nature realms alongside land, fresh water, and oceans. The planet doesn't distinguish between climate and nature, so we take a fully integrated approach to an integrated challenge, grounded in the science of the IPBES 5 main drivers of nature change, which help inform business action. Our recommendations are built on the Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD. We have carried all 11 recommended disclosures from TCFD and integrated those into the TNFD recommendations. Plus, we have added 3 additional recommended disclosures, which I've highlighted in the slide. These cover important areas, namely engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders, as well as the interface with priority locations and value chains. Beyond risk and resilience, working with nature is also vital for delivering net zero commitments, with nature being one of our best allies for delivering net zero and nature positive outcomes. We often find that climate is a familiar starting point for many organizations. Sustainability teams, although they may be lean, start by leveraging existing climate-related data and skills. We're finding through pilot testing of the TNFD recommendations that often organizations that have done assessments and disclosure of climate-related issues have found working on nature-related issues easier and more approachable. Companies can use existing supply chain engagement data, due diligence processes, and sustainability governance to incorporate nature risk practices in line with the TNFD recommendations, allowing them to build on their climate reporting efforts. An integrated risk management approach is also emerging, where we're seeing a number of companies and financial institutions leveraging across both climate and nature-related risks into their investment decisions. This slide is a happy slide for me. It's one of the slides that me and my team work on globally, and it highlights our global uptake. We've got more than 526 global companies. Sneak peek, you can go and look at the updated details on our website, but this highlights the number of companies and financial institutions globally that are committed to voluntary reporting of their nature-related issues in line with the TNFD recommendations. And the number continues to grow, and we actively are asking organizations to register as adopters leading up to our large announcement at COP30 in November. We have thousands more organizations not highlighted in this slide that are using the assessment tools, such as the LEAP approach that I talked about earlier, internally to help them understand what their nature-related issues might be and how best they can respond. These numbers represent over 17.7 trillion assets under management. It's larger than that. We have 54 jurisdictions covered globally of adopters, 24 of which come from emerging and developing markets, which I think is relevant for today. 62 of the 77 SASB sectors are also covered by a number of companies that also represent a market cap of more than 6.6 trillion US dollars. I did a bit of number crunching just before this webinar, and I just wanted to highlight in these numbers, the Asia Pacific region is our largest adoption region, with more than 47% of that number coming from the Asia Pacific region, with Japan being the leader globally. But the UK is the second largest of all adopters. We have more than 14 confirmed TNFD adopters across Africa, a small but yet significant number, and hopefully growing this year. I know that there's a lot of work happening with a mix of financial institutions in that 14 number across Africa, interestingly from insurance companies and commercial banks, and then led largely also obviously corporations in that number too, but led by Kenya, Mauritius, and then South Africa. I thought it was helpful to quickly give a few tidbits on sectoral details as well. Globally, financial institutions are our largest adopters. Large industry adopter segments come from the asset management industry, followed by commercial banks and then insurance. So slightly different on the African continent. And then from a real economy sector perspective, really interesting to see the sectors with the largest groupings coming from the real estate segment across the built environment, engineering, construction, material and services, electric utilities and power, generators coming up a lot, metals and mining, food retailers and agri-products, forestry, paper and pulp, just to name a few. And I know on today's call, there are a number of stakeholders from different organizations in those sectors. So really just highlighting that across key industries, I think you can see that a lot of industries and examples can be found on our website. We've got more than 70 illustrative TNFD reporting examples listed on our website across all of those sectors, all important sectors in Africa, largely where quite a lot of the growth comes from, where employment is critical, and also where a lot of innovation is coming from. So do take a look at our website and look at some of the details across geographies, across sectors, because I think those are really important ways to help support organizations on this journey. And then just lastly, a quick overview of how I kind of want to pinpoint the approach before we have the discussion, Wendy, which is I think the framework provides support both from a recommendations and guidance perspective. I always like highlighting our sector guidance because I think that that is really helpful for organizations that operate in that sector, invest in that sector, or perhaps have supply chain or value chain implications across sectors. Practical tools, of which there are a plethora of technology providers, consulting providers, data providers who are helping. The internal assessment on the left-hand side, really important, where LEAP fits in. On the right-hand side, ultimately getting to reporting, but you can't report until you've done all of that assessment work. And then the criticality of data and metrics and measurements, helping identify, assess, and report those material nature-related issues. So hopefully that's an overview. And Wendy, I'm going to hand back to you and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Candice. That was such a great overview of what TNFD is. And I really like that it, together with the TCFD, focuses on risk that's positive and negative. So, you know, that's a different mindset for many people to think about how does this provide opportunities as well. So it is quite complex. I mean, I think if you're coming into it for the first time, so I'd like to turn to the other members of the panel now and ask you, where do people start? What are some of the, I mean, Candice mentioned the sector-based guidance that they have for the TNFD. But if you're an organization starting off with looking at TNFD, where do you start? Kieran, can I ask you first?
You most certainly can. And thank you, Wendy. I'd say quickly coming from, say, the financial institutions perspective right now, just state of the market, what we're experiencing, and particularly in EMEA and potentially also globally, is a lot of the financial institutions are coming from solely the risk management perspective, looking at their loan book and seeing whether or not ecosystem services will continue to supply the company's critical natural assets so they continue to operate. So they're coming from really a risk management perspective, running this at a portfolio level and just looking at outliers, which then facilitates stewardship and engagement activities. I know Encore has been a frequently mentioned tool to facilitate looking at the materiality, or let's say looking at the dependencies, to use the TNFD wording, that a corporate would have on ecosystem services and looking at the resilience of these ecosystem services. When I look at the corporate's perspectives, I would say that's also a very similar approach to be done. There's really that locate and evaluate part of the LEAP framework. So typically Encore is being frequently referenced. And if I was to use an example, we were speaking with a large cement manufacturer that's gone through all of their assets to look. Obviously, cement manufacturers rely on water. I think that's going to be the same case for mining companies and many corporate institutions. They're going to then identify which of their assets, the areas of operations, or even within the supply chain, are facing water risk. Because if there is significant, let's say, drought or lack of access to water to continue to operate these corporate facilities, they will no longer be able to continue to provide the goods for which they are promising downstream. So typically what we've been seeing, at least at this early stage, is using, let's say, the Encore tool in addition to the TNFD framework to start with that locate and evaluate, and additionally the assess and preparedness approach.
Thank you. Candice S., do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Wendy, and great to see so many colleagues from all over the African continent on this webinar. So building on what Kieran said, I'm going to take the other side of that coin, a different lens on the opportunity side. So while risk has to be addressed, I think to Candice Dott's point around moving beyond the compliance lens, there's also the opportunity space. Nature markets are still emerging, but there's an incredible amount of growth and space in nature markets. And so when organizations are looking at TNFD, there is the lens of being able to address risk, but there's also the ability to become aware of opportunities in growing markets. And I think when we look at what we have on the African continent, and I might be biased, so forgive me, but we're really sitting with the greatest natural assets on the planet. And so when we're dealing with economic growth and we want to address that sustainably and at the same time protect our natural asset base, there is the ability to be able to create jobs, to boost economies, and to do so in emerging green markets. And that does require us to move outside of the norm, move outside of our comfort zones. And so TNFD starts to give a framework to understand the complexity of nature and biodiversity while we address risk, as well as start to become aware of opportunities that organizations may not have been aware of before with emerging nature markets.
Thank you, Candice. Warrick, do you want to give us some sort of non-finance advice? Because I know you work with sort of a lot of industrial clients that are doing this. Where would they start with doing something like this? And how would you link it with if they're already doing TCFD reporting?
Sure, absolutely. Happy to. Thanks, Wendy. I think from my perspective, where I've worked with a lot of mining companies, steel companies, industrial sector companies, is that often TNFD, TCFD, these kind of frameworks sit within the compliance department, sit within the accounting department, and it's really their responsibility to push out these regulatory reports. So I would say that one of the first key steps is to really set up a lot more collaboration with the actual technical teams. What we find is, especially with miners, is that a lot of the fundamental work has already been done and has been for years. Environmental impact assessments are not a new thing to industries like mining. A lot of the data in very large reports has been accumulated for years because that has been the requirement of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. So by starting those relationships with those technical teams and having a targeted joint team to take this forward, they can start to see what's already there and then start to build things, materiality, where are the gaps, where have we already covered? So I think that's an important thing, is building that inter-business relationship to be able to deliver the technical aspects of a lot of what the TNFD requires.
All right, can I just ask you a follow-up question, and any of the panelists, other panelists can jump in if they want. It's not only the inter-business, but between businesses as the value chain, which I think Candice D spoke about earlier. Any advice around there? Because sometimes it's difficult enough to get the data for your own company, and you've got to start reporting along your supply chain. What are some of those issues, and how do we get around that?
Absolutely, that's a challenge once you move away from, quantifying your direct impacts and dependencies, to use more technical terms, establishing what is material to the value chain and where your most exposure might be, because it might be in that value chain where you are highly exposed, is important. And I really think that fits around that materiality assessment. For financial institutions, it will be their loan books. For technical companies that are B2C, it will be further down the start of the value chain where their highest exposures are. So it's really quantifying where those points are and then building that out. But happy to hear from the rest of the team on more suggestions.
I think also on that point, it's integral to the ongoing operations of your business. Of course, I think the TNFD is a fantastic way to illustrate and to guide, say, reporting, risk management, opportunity identification. But I would say for the most part, while data can be a limitation, like you've highlighted, Wendy, if you know your tier one suppliers, you understand which companies are providing you with the, let's say, the greatest impact for you to continue to run your operations. Therefore, you should be able to have a bit more of an engagement approach with these companies. And you may have 1,000 suppliers, tier 1 through tier N suppliers. I don't know if I would jump off the ship and say, let's do all 1,000 right away. I would probably look at the core tier 1 most material suppliers and engage further. But I think not taking that initial step to say what is material to ongoing part of my business would be a limitation if you're just going to try and do 1,000 right away, and to first, say, target the most material companies within your supply chain. And of course, there are plethora of data points or tools to enable you to kind of map supply chains, map ownership structures. That is available in the marketplace.
Thank you. Candice D, do you want to add to that?
I think I'm finding almost to Candice S's feedback, you're seeing a ton of innovative solutions around supply chains. I mean, I literally listened to a podcast this morning, which is how I try and start my day. And one of which was a large international asset management firm in their private equity space, focusing quite deliberately on the SME space and equally on this supply and value chain space and the technologies that are helping support some of the data requirements in that space. So I would say it's an area to keep watching. It's one where you're seeing in reports as well, and not massively dissimilar to some of the climate journey, where Scope 3 was and is and continues to be a tricky area for disclosure. Why not use some of the same procurement processes, some of the same due diligence processes, and try and gather that from some of the material suppliers, which may be slightly different in the climate and nature space, admittedly.
Thank you. Anyone else from the panel want to add to that? Okay, I'm going to turn to now talking about, so what does this mean for Africa? And some of you have already touched on the fact that this can be an opportunity to do things differently and find new business models and new business opportunities through looking at the TNFD. Warrick, because you work with companies across Africa, what do you think are going to be the implications for us specifically? Because we try very hard at, you can see in our name, Sustainability and ESG Africa, to think specifically about what is the context for us, building on what somebody was saying earlier about SMMEs and the supply chain as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one of the first points here is that, Africa has the chance to characterize resolution. And really what that means is a lot of the continent hasn't been characterized in terms of, scientifically based biodiversity metrics as much as other continents where every square kilometer has a PhD on it. So by forward thinking and really establishing how we're going to conduct this, we have the chance to, characterize all of our different resources that we have that are being generated from nature in a far more standardized way to identify those opportunities beforehand. As well as, a lot of the different, and I'll take the mining sector again as an example, we can really start to rethink how we're already operating in terms of generating opportunities. Traditionally, where we're sitting at in terms of financial institutions giving capital access is we're at a point now where institutions are saying we have this amount of assets in our portfolio, 46% of them are in key biodiversity areas. That's just far too much to just start excluding investments based on key biodiversity areas. So we really need to go a lot deeper in determining how companies are managing those assets. And I think that's where we can really shine in being forward-facing, in showcasing our positive impacts. And a very interesting one, local context being is the reprocessing of all the old mine tailings in Johannesburg. That's actually a positive. We are restoring and regenerating nature, which is where in areas which has been previously degraded by tailings, because we're reprocessing those tailings to extract more gold from them. So we need to really be highlighting these positive effects that we're having.
Anyone else on the panel want to add to that? Where's some good Africa examples of where it's an opportunity? Candice S., I see you nodding. You want to go?
Thanks, Wendy. So I really do believe that we have to be honest and place a spotlight on some of the cross-cutting issues that the continent faces. So we're looking at emerging economies and the spillover results that come from that. So there's this tension between the need for growth and the importance of being able to secure those natural assets and build sustainably. And I think where some of those key opportunities sit is being able to look at the intersection of the informal sector, so the buildup of SMMEs and helping them to bridge the gap, importantly. So there is a missing middle in that space. The other is that we don't have to face the same type of future that many other markets are staring down the barrel at. So when we look at results from the World Economic Forum, Candice Dott highlighted them in Nedbank's report, we are facing some critical issues around climate and nature, and they're placing some of our biggest markets, our biggest institutional investors at risk. And so if Africa is going to grow, but grow sustainably, we have the opportunity to be able to build out economies without facing those same risks. We also need to look at our ability across the African continent on energy. So an incredible amount of energy space to be able to build that out. And then talking about some concrete examples, and I'm really going to highlight some of the innovative space that we're seeing in Africa. I do believe that just based on need and based on being resilient, there is an incredible amount of innovation coming off the continent, particularly around nature finance solutions. So we look at things like biodiversity credits building on the back of carbon credits. It's still very nascent, but there's an incredible amount of innovation enabling us to create markets directly attached and directly attributable to nature itself. And so there are a number of biodiversity credit projects across the continent with a new African Buyers Club for biodiversity credits on the horizon, which is incredibly exciting. And so we're able not only just to push the stock standard approach to building out our opportunities, but also being able to innovate and look at finance solutions that are directly attributable to nature. And Africa really is the breeding ground for that.
Okay, we have...
Sure, not necessarily African. So obviously Candice mentioned about biodiversity credits being a form of liquidity that can be achieved, but there's simply it's disclosure is really critical. So Candice Dott highlighted a number of the biodiversity funds that are taking place now, targeting companies that are, say, contributing positively to biodiversity or, say, reducing the negative impact that they may have. Give or take about 24 there's about 24 funds currently, at least large listed ones that are available. If you do not disclose information towards your, say, impact or your dependencies, it's very hard for financial institutions to allocate opportunity globally for this, but particularly also in Africa, where there is a plethora of capital still to be allocated. But there's a lot of these financial institutions are looking for the great assets to invest in. But with absence of disclosure, they're not going to be able to make decisions with conviction.
So we often hear this argument, and actually for this year's conference, we're busy doing some research work with one of our partners to test that statement. Does disclosure actually increase capital flows into Africa? Because it's often made, and it would be really great to see where and how that actually happens. So if you have any information, please let us know. So a couple of people on the Q&A are asking to give a little bit more information about the biodiversity credits, because I think it's a new concept that people may not have heard of. So can we just, can somebody, Candice, you brought it up. Do you want to just give the audience a little overview of what they are and how they work?
Happy to do so. We also have a number of open source resources which we can make available in the chat if you'd like to do a deep dive and go through the wormhole of biodiversity credits. But essentially, biodiversity credits are being developed on the back of what we've experienced in carbon credits, and hopefully we'll learn from some of the mistakes that we've made in developing carbon credits. But essentially, it really is an investment in nature for nature's sake. So being able to look at a quantifiable, measurable unit of biodiversity, and this is where data, metrics, and methodology are so important. They're fundamental to nature finance. They're fundamental to disclosure on nature-related risk. So that's where the journey really is hand in glove the whole time. And so when we're able to take the complexity of biodiversity and place it into a measurable unit, this is something that can become part and parcel of an investment dashboard, and to be able to apply capital into those investments in nature credits. Biodiversity credits, to be completely honest, I feel is the wrong term that we've landed on globally. I think credits is probably a misnomer. And just to state up front that the Biodiversity Credit Alliance globally, the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits as well, all putting out global guidance, and we've applied that within the African continent as well, is biodiversity credits are not biodiversity offsets. So the two are distinct. They each have their role to play. They each have a significant position, both in opportunity and risk when we're looking at nature finance. But importantly, when we're talking about nature credits or biodiversity credits, this is really the focus on how do we invest in natural assets, keeping those natural assets in their best possible position.
Thank you. I hope that answered the question that we had in the chat. So I want to just go back to some of the tools, because for any of you that have done a LEAP process, there's a list in there of the tools and resources and data sources you can use, and it's very long and extensive. So if you're starting out a process like this, how can you decide which are the appropriate tools for you, and where can you get some? I mean, obviously in the sector guidance that TNFD has put out, there's some guidance. But if you're a small company, and I see there was a question, Candice, that you answered, Candice Dott, that you answered. If you're a smaller company, how do you start this journey? So Candice, do you want to share that with us, Candice D?
Sure. So I highlighted, I think we recently launched our capacity building tool. So I'm just going to start there, because I think that that's a really important layer where it's framing of language, it's framing of context setting. It is also useful to guide people through the LEAP approach, or certainly not specific to the tools, because we're not advocating for one tool over another. There are a plethora of different tools and data solutions and providers. But I think that it's important to take a look at our capacity building section on our website. It's really new, and it's something that is being built on almost by the day. And I say that within the context of the African continent, as well as some of the other emerging and developing markets, because I think the details around case studies and use cases is going to be really important. So we have something called the Learning Lab. I don't think that it immediately solves for all SME challenges. I don't think that that is something that's yet solved for across the board. I think that's why it's going to take a number of different stakeholders and pretty innovative solutions to support SMEs more broadly all the way down through the value chain. But I would say that a number of organizations, large organizations that are able to go deeper into their supply chains, are supporting SME stakeholders that are important to their analysis. But equally, that Learning Lab area, we've actually designed and integrated tools, webinars, different approaches, different applications to help take people through a LEAP assessment journey. So you can literally do that in your own time. It's free to sign up for. It's a login, and that's all we ask for. And you literally can take your kind of own guided, self-paced journey. So that's where I would start, Wendy.
Thank you so much. That's really useful. And I put a link in the chat where it's on your website that talks about the launch of it and has got all the links to the different resources. It's very, very useful. I've used it myself, and it's really good. Thank you for that, Candice. I want to just talk a little bit about, because we haven't really spoken about it, about the future focus of both the TCFD and TNFD, and the use of scenarios and other tools like that which is a really unique and I think very needed approach to looking at some of these risks and opportunities, both in nature and climate, and they're so interlinked. So has anybody had any, Warrick or anybody else or Candice, had any experience with using some of these scenarios, and can perhaps just give the participants on this webinar a bit of an idea of how it fits into the overall TNFD process? Warrick, do you want to start, and then maybe Candice Dott, you can carry on?
Yeah. Absolutely, and it is quite a complex thing to do. At S&P, we've started to release some white papers and some research, because we have two existing data sets, essentially, one on physical risk and climate change, and again, our biodiversity one, and they're very interlinked. One of the most obvious examples is the water and water stress. Both of them are looked at within both solutions. So we've really started to do a lot of research in looking for correlation between the different scientific-based metrics that we leverage within our solutions that are across both climate transition, physical risk, transition risk, and nature. So hopefully I will be able to provide some updates on that later down the line. But I will share some links as well on some of the existing research that we've done.
Thank you.
Maybe Kieran has a bit more on that.
I can follow after Candice.
Candice D, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to call out, I think, some of the work that the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, has been doing, because I think when you see this at a sort of macro level, that's quite helpful. I think the work that treasury teams in different countries and central banks are using to do this, and how they perhaps are applying this to some of their climate scenario work, or looking at that integration of the two, is really helpful. And there's quite a bit written up about that. We again also have guidance on scenarios, but equally you're seeing, I would say there are a handful of corporates that are venturing into the scenario analysis space, but certainly it's a familiar space for risk management teams and banks. So I would look at our examples again on our website, because there are a few examples listed of the TNFD aligned examples that we try and list. There are many, many more. So probably use a bit of Google searching, AI tooling, ChatGPTing, and I think you're going to find an overwhelming number of scenario-like approaches that are being applied in the nature space.
Hi, Candice, can I just ask you a follow-up question? Could you just link that to how that helps with the opportunity discussion? Because we have a question in the Q&A about that, about how we strengthen the opportunities discussion. And this is one way, but what are some of the other ways?
Capacity building, not to undermine that, because I think once you understand what you're actually dealing with, and I think as companies start going into risk assessments, the nature of risks immediately turn you to kind of, how do I mitigate those risks? And often it's through the lens of net new opportunities. I think organizations can see opportunities in so many different ways. This isn't just a natural risk has to be offset with an opportunity. It could be cost benefits. I think organizations that do redesign processes end up with cost efficiencies. You're thinking about, within the context of an overwhelming demand for energy, it seems, in the world right now, I think there's an overwhelming demand for water that goes parallel with that. And I think organizations that start to look at how to manage the efficiencies around those two topics could be a really interesting lens on opportunities. Again, it's where you're seeing this innovation space. You don't drive too far now, at least from where I live, where you don't see houses full of solar panels. That wasn't economically viable a couple of years ago. I just can't wait to see what some of the, not just home solutions, but I think organizational funding solutions are that are going into some of those opportunities. In fact, we're doing a massive piece of work on opportunities right now, where not only defining it, because that's quite important and lots of people have different definitions of an opportunity, but also we'll be putting out some pretty, I think, exciting guidance. And there's some really good research on the opportunity space coming out too. So.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So The one which I think we'll do now is about, so we see a lot of people committing to doing TNFD, but we're not seeing reports being published on the African continent. Do we know what challenges companies are facing? What are some of those barriers that they are facing? Why are we not seeing that transition into publishing the documents? Anybody got any insights on that? Candice,
Wendy, yeah, I'll share just based out of the coalition's representatives. So we cover, close to 20 different sectors across many different countries. And feedback that is quite repetitive is around the fear of putting a report out there and having negative feedback. It's not deep enough. It's not accurate enough. There's a greenwashing threat. And so I think we have to be very cognizant of the space where we want organizations to adopt the likes of TNFD, etc. We want organizations to be part and parcel of a future that does focus on opportunity, that is willing to deal with risk, take on opportunities and innovations. But we essentially stop that if there is a very negative rhetoric, instead of being able to reward steps in the right direction. None of us are going to take the sustainable finance journey and be able to hit every win straight away. And so when we're setting strategic goals and those milestones, I think we need to be cognizant of an organization's milestone. And they may not be exactly where they want to be or where the sort of general opinion wants them to be, but they still need to be acknowledged for that. So that very negative perception and press, I think, holds a lot of organizations back.
No, I think that's a great point. And I mean, it's nice the way TCFD and TNFD in their reports show you which of those disclosures are actually covered in full by reporting companies, and it's very few that actually do all of them. So I mean, it's a journey, right? But like you say, people are worried about legal challenges and all kinds of things. Warrick, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and I want to echo that even no matter the outcomes, the fact that a business is reporting whatever their analysis is defined is important, because that means it's front of mind for that business, regardless of how it may be construed. And quite interestingly, and I'll put something in our chat here, is last year we analyzed about 7,000 companies globally and looked at per global region how many have conducted a nature and biodiversity risk assessment. And Africa was actually leading the way, although the numbers themselves are still quite small. 20% of the companies in Africa had reported on their nature risk assessment, whereas compared to North America, it was only 5.8%. So it just really solidifies that we need to be reporting our findings. Even if it's very rudimentary and empirical at the moment, it means that we are progressing. We cannot measure what we're not disclosing. And that's what financial institutions want to see. We hear from many financial institutions on a daily basis. I'm sure Kieran can elaborate here. Often they say to us, help us find companies to invest in that are nature positive or that have nature on their plate, that they are actively working in the space. They struggle to find investments because they have within their own business, they're mandated to put certain amounts of budget into that investing framework that they've committed to. So reporting is so important.
Kieran, do you want to add to that before I go to Candice D? I saw you had your hand
Sure.
up.
Yeah, there's actually a point that Candice was also highlighting when on the risk management side and the opposite side of that coin being opportunity. And I wanted to highlight a little anecdote and also similar to what Warrick was highlighting. Candice mentioned energy savings, water risk. Warrick had previously mentioned on tailings recycling as opportunities, a few of many opportunities. What we're seeing is that corporates that are running risk management assessments to see, okay, what ecosystem services do they have significant reliance on? That becomes an opportunity for other companies to say, okay, I can see that this company is exposed to water stress. Let me go and sell this company a rainwater collection facility. Or let me, as an alternative supplier of untreated water, maybe it's a beverage company, provide a supply of untreated water to said facility, given that I see this company has an asset in an area of water stress and would rely on an alternative source of water. So we're actually seeing that risk management lens on maybe one corporate is a significant opportunity for cross-business collaboration for others. And we're seeing a lot of our clients actually use that tool for almost business development to actually identify these opportunities, while anyways for the corporate, it becomes a risk management assessment.
Well, thank you. That's a great point. Candice D, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's also about management. And I think top-down reign that is an enabling environment that supports organizations to start to feel comfortable with voluntary disclosure. I mean, I think one of the things that's tricky is obviously you end up disclosing in public financial statements, and it's a voluntary disclosure within that. But you see a number of organizations being comfortable as long as they communicate what the remit is of the work that they've started with in terms of a TNFD aligned report. So I think it's quite helpful to go, we often get asked, is this good enough? And I don't think it's ours to judge. I think it's important that the stakeholders, be it perhaps competitive financing, you're seeing some interesting financing business development tools coming online, as more data is being disclosed, as more information is being disclosed. But equally, I think that role of investors is very important. We put out a guide last week, which I think is quite an important one because we're going to do a few this year still. One is, it's called Asking Better Questions on Nature for Board Directors. It's, I think, an important layer within organizations, and to the point for organizations that are doing the work but not necessarily comfortable with disclosing. I think this might help boards support management teams to get more comfortable with what they are then prepared to disclose. So I did and can put a link in the chat, but it makes for quite interesting reading. I think it's also important to contextualize what's important for your business. But I think if management and certainly boards and non-executive directors need to enable management. And I think if management themselves need also to support their own capacity building, which I feel like a broken record on, I think tools like this might help, and many others that are out there.
Thank you, Candice. I saw you put the link in the chat there. So I want to just take the last question that we have still outstanding from Daniel. And he raises a really important point about, so local government and national government, provincial government, all the layers of government owns a lot of natural areas, and how do they, and although we always talk about business when we talk about nature-based disclosures, how are we going to bring in the government sector into this discussion? Anybody want to take that?
Wendy, I'm happy to give a quick response on that. So something that we refer to in the coalition is a finance for nature ecosystem, and we chose the word ecosystem on purpose. So the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more alive and the more thriving it is. So when we're dealing with nature finance on the opportunity or risk side, the more diverse that ecosystem of participants is, the healthier it is. And so building public sector participants into the discussion, to Candice Dott's point on capacity building, that's not just for private sector partners, but it's for governments as well at all levels of government. So from local to national, and even transboundary, all of the tools and the resources are the same, and they're key relationships to build to be able to start that journey and walk that journey together. And the last thing I want to say to the green assets sitting, particularly within a municipal or local government space, is the issue around spatial planning. So to know exactly what sits around an urban to peri-urban to rural area, and to clearly designate what should happen within those different regions. And so that spatial planning becomes imperative for built infrastructure as well as for green infrastructure.
I guess it's the same process, right? You're going to locate, you're going to evaluate, assess, all of those same things. So governments can follow that LEAP methodology, but not necessarily report like you would for a commercial company. I'm going to take one more question. And maybe I'll ask Candice D if you can cover this question and the final closing comment around what's coming down the road at us. What are the next frameworks we're going to have to be addressing? And the question is from Sue, and it's about, with all these multiple disclosure frameworks that we're having to deal with, IFRS, TCFD, TNFD, each with their own emphasis, and you mentioned earlier that they're all very integrated. But how do we prioritize or integrate these frameworks? That's the question. And then if you could just give us an idea of what's coming next, what are some of the things that are planned for the future?
Sure. So I'm gonna use words like ongoing collaboration, because I think that the answer to the sustainability interoperability question is a global topic, and certainly one that the European Union is grappling with right now. But just with pursuit of our ongoing collaboration with all of the standards bodies, you can see we've done a lot of interoperability mapping between the GRI, EFRAG, and the CSRD reporting. So organizations that have these global requirements are certainly able to look at that within the context of not having to duplicate efforts. We're working with partners like the CDP team and their questionnaire. And again, it's not about having to report for report's sake. It's about integrating from do it once and use it many times language. So we continue to support the ISSB team on the ongoing work. They call it the Biodiversity Ecosystems and Ecosystem Services Research module, which is a project for 2 years. They're already a year into that. And I think it will be helpful to also see how some of the work going into enhancing the SASB sectors might play out, because I think it's all in pursuit of interoperability end objectives. This isn't TNFD as a separate report, TCFD, which is integrated into the ISSBS2 standard now, is, you know, all of this is about integrated reporting, in my humble opinion, and I think it's quite important that a lot of the standard setters are thinking like that. To answer your quick question on what I see coming, it's not about net new task force. Just to be clear, I'd like to touch on 2 things. I think one is the importance of transition plans. I think there's an increasing focus on that as a topic, certainly from trends in the climate space, but also the fact that there is no such thing as a nature transition plan right now. There is work going into the guidance around what that could look like, and importantly, what some of the possible gaps might be or challenges that organizations face about creating one. So we've actually got a pilot of 15 global organizations working on that currently, with more to follow shortly. I think this topic of data is mammoth. I think both Kieran and Warrick have alluded to this, but it's helpful to say this isn't just a problem of not enough data, quite frankly. I think it's important about it's more about the fact that there is so much data, but sometimes it's unstructured, hard to use, not necessarily in an assurable format. Sometimes the data is incomplete, sometimes it's old. And so a lot of work going into that, which again, work we're busy doing. And then I'm seeing quite a lot going into the space of what I would call the financial effects of nature risks. So a lot more research, more evidence going into highlighting case studies and more evidence of the financial impacts of some of these, what look like 10-year risks that are now actually much closer than that, quite frankly. So I would say all 3 of those areas. I know that the task force, there is another task force, and we talked about this briefly, Wendy, the TISFD. I think it's helpful to highlight the task force on inequality and social related financial disclosures and the work they're doing. They're equally approaching this with financial impacts and more evidence around that too. So sister task force, but certainly an organization that's doing some incredible work too.
Oh, thanks so much. And as you said, it also integrates because the social aspect is covered under TCFD and TNFD. So yeah, it is all integrated. It's just different levels of depth, I guess, and interrogation. So I just wanted to mention that our community of practice that we run as SEACon, which is a lot more interactive. It's not a webinar. It's practitioners on the ground and how they deal with these things. We are going to be dealing with this topic and including TCFD and a couple of other broader issues around reporting. And Marie Paramangoni is one of the founders of our conference, is going to be running that. So please, if you're interested, join us for there as well, so that we can do it in more depth. But I think that brings us to the end, and I'd like to just thank everybody so much for what has been a really fascinating discussion. And watch the space. It's going to continue to evolve. And as everybody has said, if there's one major takeaway from this, it's do what's material to you. That's where you start. And it can be of great benefit. It shouldn't just be looked at as a tick box exercise. So thanks so much. And with that, I'll hand back to Shannon.
Thanks, Wendy. Everyone, you'll see that there's a poll that I put up on the screen. If you can just give an answer to that one, if you would like any more information. But from there, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Before we wrap up, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Wendy Poulton, our moderator, and our guest speakers, Candice Dott, Candice Stevens, Dr. Warrick Fuchsloch, and Dr. Kieran Dobson for a very informative webinar. If you have any further questions or would like to continue the conversation, feel free to reach out to us via email at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. And if you're interested in hearing more about the Sustainability and ESG Africa Conference, please visit the website at www.esgafricaconference.com. I've also shared that information in the chat for you. And with that, I'd like to bid you all farewell. Thank you so much for your time and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Everyone.